Look up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman.
This is Dan Jurgen.
This is Jason J. Lewis, the voice of Superman on Justice League Action.
This is Mark Wade, writer of Superman Birthright.
And you're listening to the Krypton Report.
The Krypton Report podcast is dedicated to all things Superman, Supergirl, and the planet Krypton. We discuss movies, TV, game, comics, and all things DC. So join me, Tyler, with my co-host James and Jania. It is I, your host Tyler, and today I have a very special guest, another fellow Kryptonian podcaster, one of my favorite shows I've talked about multiple times that I've suggested everyone go and check out, and is with great respect, honor that I welcome Mr. the Legend, Mr. Desiato. Hello, sir.
Hello, that was quite the introduction. I am honored, and it's great to be here. I appreciate the invite. You know, you and I, we've been messaging for a while now, and so it's great to actually be able to talk to you face-to-face, virtually, but still. So thank you very much for having me. I've really been looking forward.
Oh, I'm glad that we're here. And yeah, it's a funny kind of story because what's hilarious, and there's a quick background here is I can't remember which one if I had found Digging for Kryptonite first on Facebook and was following it, and I had listened, and then I just remember I got up one day and it was something like on iTunes was an advertisement for My Comic Shop Country. And I was like, oh, this sounds awesome. This is right on my alley. And I rented it and I watched it. And first of all, the opening at Acme Comics in North Carolina, I got excited because that was near where I worked when we lived in North Carolina. And that's where I would go on my lunch break and get books and stuff. And then it wasn't until a little bit later that the two came together. I was like, wait a minute, this is the same dude. I'm like, oh, okay. So it was pretty awesome when I kind of put the pieces together that not only do you run an awesome podcast, you're also a documentary filmmaker as well.
Yeah, and I mean the comic shop projects came first for me. You know, when I was in law school, I made a documentary film about my local comic shop, Alternate Reality. Now, since it's sadly closed, and that was the first major creative project I took on, and it was just born out of all the fun that we had at the store, colorful characters, starting with the owner. And, I did that first documentary, and then I started a podcast a few years later when the store closed called My Comic Shop History. That gave way to another documentary, your reference. It was, I guess, a couple of years ago at this point that I was thinking about what the next step would be. Like, My Comic Shop History is still on, I still host that, but I just do limited runs that year. But I love podcasting. I fell in love with podcasting. And I was thinking, well, okay, what would the next thing be? And, as you well know, I don't think you can do a podcast long term and do it well unless it's something you're really passionate about. And so, I very quickly came to the conclusion, well, the natural thing, and maybe the only other contender for an ongoing, in my case, bi-weekly podcast would be something Superman. So then that led to it. But it's been, connecting with you and connecting with a bunch of our other fellow super podcasts has been one of the most unexpected delights of this whole thing. Because if there were one thing that was holding me back when I was deciding whether or not to pull the trigger on a Superman show, that there are so many others out there. Like with the Comic Shop podcast, there are some of them, but not a ton. Well, Superman, there's no shortage of those podcasts out there. I just remember thinking, I do something that would stand out. This thing, is it worth it? And again, it's just, I've been so blown away by the camaraderie within the super podcast group, on social media primarily. But it's been great, and we've, a bunch of us have exchanged plugs on our shows and have guests on each other's shows. It's really been terrific. I wasn't, not that I was expecting a cold welcome, but I didn't know what to expect. It's really been terrific.
I look at it kind of like back when I played in bands, like you'd find some friends and you'd form bands and you're like, okay, let's do shows together. Or let's help get, shows together. Or, hey, let's make our own show. You always think that there's this tension of, okay, I have to do better than them, or, but there's also this camaraderie. And I mean, with Superman, like, my show evolved because when I first started podcasting, I joined with a friend and we were reviewing Gotham, the TV series. And that's kind of what my end to podcasting was. I listened to the good version of Fat Man on Batman, is what I call it, when I fell in love with the show when he first started it, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. And then when when Krypton was announced and Supergirl, I was like, well, I want to review those. I want to do that. And then I would realize, like, I want to do more than just talk about the TV show. So, like, that's always kind of been the backbone, was reviewing the current shows. But I was like, there's so much to it. I mean, like our friend Nate, we just did a podcast. He reviews and talks about and digs into the history of Superman, the animated series. And there's so many facets. One of my favorites to listen to, because it's my smallest knowledge, is the Superboy Legacy podcast. Because for the longest time, I knew that show existed. And I felt like I would talk to people and they had no idea that it was real. And I would just have this memory of like seeing it come on like on basic cable. But it wasn't until 2006 when Superman Returns happened and there was so much stuff released on home video that it was like, see, look, there's the first season this show does exist. And then sadly, and I say that because some people still don't, I miss DC Universe. People can say whatever they want about HBO Max, but the George Reeves show is gone. Superboy is gone. All that old content that real, like, just want to dig into the history of DC, people like us who, it's not the greatest, but it's part of the legacy that I want to at least experience, is not on HBO Max.
That's been a major frustration for me. Well, in particular, Adventures of Superman and Superboy, those two are two of the more egregious omissions on HBO Max. To be honest, and I've since bought them all on DVD. I just got to the point where I said, you know what? Yeah, hopefully they'll make the jump over there at some point. Lois and Clark did recently.
Yes.
Remastered it, and that's great and everything. So I hope that at some point the other ones will, but it's like I don't want to be at their mercy. I bought these, but it's kind of baffling to me because, to your point, they were previously on the DC app, so available to them in that format, right? Mm-hmm. I just, I don't know. I mean, unless there really is some sort of licensing issue or what, but I can't imagine that that's the case. I really feel like it's a matter of them not thinking there's an audience. Maybe there's more to it, but my gut feeling is that that's kind of what's. I really think that's the same for people like us who would love to visit it, but also for new people to discover it. And I'm like you, Superboy is definitely one of. I don't have a ton of huge gaps in my super fandom anymore, but that's one of them. Yeah. And I will eventually close it, and now I'm going to have to do that via DVD.
Yeah, it's slowly shrinking. But, there's that where you watch it, and I've seen it, but then there's that I can recite it, I can quote it, I can like scripture, like, okay, here it is, and that's how you can do like with a lot of Smallville. You're like, hey, this season, this episode, this happens, and it just comes from that repetition. And I just want to say, like, you were talking about things, and as of this recording, DC fandom has just happened. Did you watch any of it or just check out any of it?
Watched a little bit of it. I wasn't glued, to the screen watching the whole thing, but I would check out stuff after I saw the headline. So, I certainly watched the Batman and Flash trailers. I watched the Superman and Lois set visit. I watched Supergirl farewell. So I guess in the end, I watched probably a good percent.
I had it. I didn't get to watch it yesterday because we were at a con yesterday, and I watched the whole stream today. I just had kind of on in the background as I was doing some other things, and you were talking about having things, and one of the things they announced that shows to me that they're really trying to get their stuff in house is HBO Max is taking over Pennyworth. They're bringing Pennyworth from Epix to HBO Max and making that a Max original. So it shows me that they're like trying to get all their stuff back home and finding their home. But That's not what we're here to talk about. And the funny thing, and I point out to you, is two Superman fans here talking on this day, and as of this recording, it's the 17th of October, which is Jerry Siegel's birthday, which is why I'm wearing my Action Comics #1 hoodie. We were going to take a drive and go up to the Siegel house today to celebrate, but my wife had to work, and so that threw that out the window.
Yeah, what an occasion! And I'm sorry to admit I wasn't dialed into the date when you messaged me. But that's terrific, and I'm so glad that we can have a fun Superman chat on his birthday. Yeah,
it's one of those because I'm trying to remember how many years ago now. Back in 2018, Jerry and Joe are from Cleveland, and I live south of Columbus, so it's a little under 3-hour drive to Cleveland. And we went, and they did the Cleveland Library did a huge thing called From Cleveland to Krypton, and they had a bunch of Superman artifacts, and they had Jerry's typewriter. They had a lot of stuff, and had it was raining that day, we would have went over to the house after that, but it was raining, so we were like, okay, we'll come back another time. So it's always kind of been because of that the date, my wife's birthday is in October. It just kind of stays in the consciousness. And I also makes me always wonder why Kansas was chosen for Smallville and not Ohio. I feel like that would have been an interesting, more logical choice, being that they were from Ohio. But whatever.
I never really thought about that. That is a good question.
I did. One day I was like, why can't? I'm like, who made Kansas? But we have, I feel like we have so much to talk about, and we could talk a lot about just, your filmmaking aspects. But I think we'll save that for another day. We'll have to just talk film another day.
That's perfectly fine.
Because, I have an idea for a documentary it's more serious, and it's been floating, and I've done a little work on it, and it's one of those things I want to do, but I'm a little scared and nervous because of the subject matter. And it's, I get personal on the show all the time. I don't care. And this just back context is the episode of Superman and Lois this season that touched us as a family the most is when Lois talked about her miscarriage, because my wife and I have gone through 4 of them. And one day my wife and I were talking about doing a documentary about the struggles of women have with miscarriages, but also how that concept is common and people just think, oh, no big deal. There's been so many women who suffered from this loss and emotional, and people treat it as if, oh, you really weren't pregnant or whatever. And I'm not going to go down no rabbit holes right here, but it's a documentary that I've had kind of just, I feel like it's kind of been laid on my wife and I together to partner and do this thing. So I figure we could talk film because I could get some pointers from you about just the process.
I'm happy to talk, on or off mic, about that whenever you like. Very sorry to hear that. I think, a project like that, it touch a lot of. I agree. I mean, I think it is one of those things that you have to deal with quietly, internally, behind closed doors. But it's something that touches so much. Like you said on Superman and Lois, I appreciated that they told that story. They're able to shine a light. Watch who, appreciated seeing the characters going through something so human, so real, so relatable. So yeah, I mean, a project like that, I think that would be a compelling.
I've heard you talk about it, and I'll throw my 2 cents is with this character, it's interesting because Smallville happened when I was in high school. It started. I was a sophomore and Clark was a freshman, but we were both 15. Just how that fell. Mm-hmm. And I went through high school with Clark, then into college, and then the in between years, and then when Smallville ended, was mere weeks after my wedding. So, this show carried me in my life. And then now we jump ahead to Superman and Lois. When I'm married, I've been married now for 10 years. And I have 2 kids. Sure, my kids aren't as old as their kids, But the idea of, I now have my character going through fatherhood, and I'm going through this. It's like, it's just kind of, it's really awesome then to have these stories that I connect with. I mean, yesterday I had the honor I talked to him before on a podcast, but I got the honor to meet him face to face and talk to Dan Jurgens. And the books that I presented to him to sign was Superman Convergence #1 and Lois and Clark #1. And it was The Birth of John Kent. And then when they did that story that was going to tie into Rebirth, and I said to him, I was like, these stories meant a lot to me because these came out, John Kent was born the same year that my son was born. So I became a father at the same time that Superman became a father. And Dan's like looking at like, yeah, that's all, it's like you could tell it's like emotional. He signed them. And I'm sure most people are like, let's talk about Death of Superman. I'm like, nah, let's talk about this, this. Like, I wanted to be like, let's talk about Electric Blue Superman just to throw him off, but I didn't have that much time. But it was a great experience. And, having just listened to your part of your From Crisis to Death and segment, which has been great, just kind of contextualizing more of where Superman was at that time. Dan Jurgens had a large role to play in the whole death. So I was like, the first person I thought like I have to send a message to about this was you, but my signal was bad. So you're like, nothing's coming through. And I'm just like,
Yeah, it was funny because you're like, I thought you would appreciate this. And I waited a couple minutes and I was like, I'm not seeing anything. But then eventually the photos, I've not had the opportunity to meet Dan Jurgens, although a buddy of mine met him at Horrificon a couple of years ago. And I'm grateful to my buddy and to Dan Jurgens. Dan recorded a video to me acknowledging that responsible for getting me into comics. It was very cool. I still have that saved, and I hope to be able to meet him at some point. Like you said, we've been talking a lot about early Triangle era my show, and that's super big. I've not yet made any attempt to try to get Dan Jurgens on the show. My sense is that he would be receptive to doing something like that, but I have no idea. But it's one of those things where I'm waiting before I would even try to do that because I like that people ask him about Death of Superman all the time. So I would really want to be able to find a way to come at it from some kind of different angle. And then there's also this, someone was asking me about recently, you got to get Dan Jurgens, I'm a big Death of Superman guy. I sort of feel like when the time comes that I'm really going to wind down the podcast, that's a long way down the road, but I sort of feel like that'll be one of the sort of the final step. Like we're in the final season of Smallville. Like the final pieces are coming into place, that sort of. But I would love to talk.
You'd be like, hey, Dan, let's just talk Booster Gold. I'm sure no one ever wants. Yeah. And I mean, and that's the thing is like, you want to talk about Death of Superman, but at the same time, you're like, man, like, I'm sure everyone always asks you about it. And like you said, you want to come at it. The best question would be, Dan, how does it feel to only be asked about Death of Superman? And go. But I had something I wanted to show you. For those who can't see us, who are listening, I found this at a comic book store poster that they just had in the back all folded up. Can you see it?
Dan, Superman is back.
And I'm like, I have nowhere to put it. It's my problem. Like, it's so massive. I'm like, I mean, I even have posters, like small, like stuff I've got from like the movie theaters and like stuff that are tiny posters on my ceiling. And I'm like, I don't have anywhere for this massive poster. But I'm like, that was just such a cool find. And it was back there with like all these posters. And they're like, yeah, you can just take it. It's fine. I'm like, all right. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great score. I'm so glad that you got it.
It's got Mike Carlin's signature on it. It's mass produced, Mike Carlin's, but it was still cool because I took a picture and I Facebook messaged like Mike Carlin's like, is this your signature? Because I wasn't sure because he's like, yeah, that's me. I was like, awesome.
That's so. Honestly, and I appreciate the shout out, that run of episodes I'm doing. I won't rehash all of it, but I'll just say that it has been beyond fulfilling to go back to the stories that got me into Superman, but now armed with the context of the preceding years. And it's a sort of thing I always look back at Death and Funeral and Bond because they got me. Always that love there. But, now there's that. Plus, I just appreciate them as stories in and of themselves in a way that I didn't before. It's just been just an absolute gift to get that new insight into and appreciation for these stories that have been with me so long. Yeah, it's been great.
And what's interesting is I remember when Death happened and it being like on the news and everything. And I've told stories where I was young and comics were harder to find because we were a military family, and the only place I could constantly find them was on a spinner rack at one of the uniform shops my dad went to. But, I didn't always get to go with him. It wasn't like a continual time. So I'd find what I could where I could. And, reading Death and everything later, I realized that out of all of that, Funeral is my favorite because it's the legacy book that talks about what Superman really meant to people. And we won't go into it because your episode covers it beautifully. And for those who are listening, that one of my questions is always like, well, what got you into Superman? And I'm not even going to ask him because he said it. And if you want the full story, go listen to his last episode because he beautifully articulates the importance of that moment of, seeing the Death of Superman comic and what that meant to him. And it's a great story. Like, I love hearing where people come from because a lot of times you hear like over on the other, with the other guy, that guy with ears, you always hear like the Adam West Show or like Batman the Animated Series. Sometimes you hear Batman 89, but I feel like if you were old enough for Batman 89, you already knew Adam West. And if you're a little younger, you had the animated series around the corner. You know what I'm saying? So,
yeah.
But with Superman, I find like it's been interesting because you automatically think, oh, the Chris films, that's everyone's. And for me, it was kind of like there was always this sense of already. And I remember I have it up here, the VHS of the Fleischer cartoons. And that's the ones I first remember. And then, oh, thank you. My beautiful wife just delivered me some hot tea here on this cold Ohio day.
Very nice, yes. I had some delicious tomato soup earlier, so it was a very crisp day here in Connecticut as well.
Yeah, it was one of those days like I woke up and I was like, oh, yes, finally fall. And what's funny is my wife was actually, I mentioned like my favorite fall food is grilled cheese tomato soup. That's why it's funny you said that because I was gonna make it. She's like, no. She's like, when I get home from work, I'll make some homemade chicken noodle soup. And then she got held up and got home late, so I was like, shucks. But it's just funny that you said that. See, that's how we were made to be friends.
That's right. Yeah, for sure.
So let's dig into a little bit more here. Just some of the fun questions that I have, and then we'll get it. We actually have a topic we're going to discuss because you're very. I don't say you're very in like the comic books, is where you're digging more. And I love doing the comic books, but I'm also very much a media person. And the irony is we actually had a lot more comic books based stuff planned because I write out my calendar. But because of how they've done the shows for COVID, there hasn't been a stop really in a super series. Because as soon as Superman and Lois ended, Supergirl picked back up.
Right.
So it's been this continual run. So we really have had, coherent, continual sets. So it's like, man, we have a lot of stuff coming at us for once compared to usually we have a little bit of break. We can dig into other things. So here's the first question. Your favorite version of Superman. Is it a comic book? Is it a certain comic book? Is it a certain actor's portrayal or whatever? Go. And it don't have to be a long explanation.
I'll try to keep it short. I mean, this is something that I've definitely thought about and come up on my show as well.
Of course it has.
It's one of the reasons I wanted to do the show was to take this long view of the character across time and see how they play off of it, how they develop. So I will give an actual answer, but let me just say this, and this is not me sitting on the fence, but the thing that's been so fascinating is seeing how character evolves, how there's something meaningful, valuable about virtually incarnation. And the example that I always go to is the George Reeves show. That was one of the big gaps in my fandom until the beginning of 2020. Now I hold that up, one of my favorite versions. And it's very different than modern incarnation, but it works so well, especially for the time. And, really, maintains especially those early seasons, the essence of the original comic. So I'll say that. Now, the actual answer, I have to go Tom Welling. That Smallville, and you and I had a very similar experience, right? I too was in high school, and it just tracked with what I mean, not the sci-fi aspect, but it's just, our journeys parallel each other. So,
I was running around at night, fighting the evil in my town.
But, so that show, really, one of the pieces of homework for our recording tonight that I know we'll get into was an episode of Smallville 8 Bloodline. And, I haven't watched season 8 sometime, and so, but I queued up that episode. I was right back. And that is one of those shows that I can quote. You can throw any episode at me. I'm right there with you. So the Tom Welling incarnation arc is the one that I think nearest and dearest. If I approached it a little more analytically, I think my answer might change. But in my heart, that's.
And I say, that's kind of where I am, because what's funny is, as much as I complain about these superhero shows, I'm like, give me the costumes. I want the costumes. Somehow Smallville Clark pulled it off, and that I was like, okay, like I buy it. Like, I'm okay with not having the costume. It blows my mind. But, yesterday was the 20th anniversary of Smallville, and we were at the con, and Tom and Michael were there, and we actually got to talk to Tom and get our picture taken with Tom, me and my two buddies. I was like, what a way to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Smallville, guys. And it's crazy, because I'm like, my fashion in high school was like, who you might find? Blue shirt, red jacket, red shirt, blue jacket. Really got a primary color palette, some flannel. Smallville impacted my fashion, And
exactly the same here. I've posted this photo when they revealed the photos of Tom Welling Crisis TV crossover participant wearing that red flannel shirt. Literally, I was like, I own that. I already owned it. Smallville had so shaped my fashion. When Tom Welling came back years later, I had that shirt. I put it on, and I took a photo. I think, I'm right there with you. And that's awesome that you got to meet them. Like,
it was cool. What's funny is, my wife last year, she bought me a blue vest. Like, she's like, I found this on sale and I got it for you. And I have a bunch of flannel shirts, and I had a flannel on. I put that vest on. I was like, this feels oddly familiar. And I pull up, it looks almost identical to Christopher Reeve in Superman 4 when he's on the farm and the guy comes and he's selling it,
Yep.
And I'm like, passes the approval. But I'm right there with you with Tom, but Tyler is winning me over. And I think, and part of it is what I feel like when they did the writer's room for Superman and Lois, they had a giant board and they went through every incarnation of the character and talked about what worked, what people liked, and then they just mixed it together. And with Tyler's portrayal, we're getting like the greatest hits version, because it seems like he's hitting everything and like where people want. He's finding that right blend of the different versions, and so he's winning me over. But
yeah, I'll and this is one thing that I've been upfront about on my show, that I don't mind, and in fact, I'm happy to change my position. And that's one example where I certainly didn't hate his portrayal of the character in the Arrow prior to Super, but it didn't necessarily blow me away. And at the time, but definitely now in retrospect, I reckon he was serving a supporting role function, and I think in that aspect, character worked. And there, his first introduction in the season 2 premiere of Super, I thought was great. I really did like that.
Yes.
Subsequent appearances, again, I didn't feel like he made that strong of an impression, but man, have I loved him on Superman. That show, again, going back to Unexpected Delight, it's just, it's beautiful. And like yourself, I too am now a young father. So it does really just feel like a gift that we keep getting these strong Superman stories that match where we are in our personal. It's like, I'm sure I would like Superman and Lois. What?
Yeah.
I definitely like it. I love it more, because I can identify with the familial aspect.
It's kind of like, I'll go down the thumb, but it's like the reverse of how Spider-Man was in my life. I was in high school and I got Tobey Maguire, who's in high school, who all of a sudden just gets aged up and then he's out and he's an adult. And now, like, I'm an adult and I get like Peter in high school. And I'm like, yay, Spidey, but I just quite don't connect with you because you're in high school.
Yeah.
But it's funny because we did an episode before the premiere of Superman and Lois. We went back and we watched all the Tyler appearances and we broke it down and talked about it. And exactly like what you said was he made a big impact on the first, episode of Supergirl. But then after that, you could tell they wanted him. And he did what podcast was it Tyler was on? Maybe it was the Hall of Justice. I'm trying to remember. He did a great explanation of how, he said like he could tell Berlanti wanted to keep him. He kept finding a way to scoot him in there to eventually get to the point where they could pitch to have the show because he was just a supporter. He was in the background. They didn't give him much to do because it wasn't his show. Like you didn't want him to overshadow the other characters that he's there, supporting. And so when he finally got like, it's his show, it was like, here you go. And it was great. And I love it. I can't praise that show enough because I finally feel like it's the family Superman show that I've been wanting for a long time. And we watch it with the kids. Like it became, because I bought it on iTunes, so we'd watch it Wednesday morning over breakfast as a family, like I'd make breakfast, time to watch Superman and Lois. So now, in that same thought, and this is where it can get tricky, what's your favorite Clark Kent? Because the Tom Welling can kind of like, it's that kind of like, because technically he's Clark, but he's also the Blur or Super, so, but, you're talking about George and my buddy Brian, he started reading comics. He started DC comics and reading them chronologically. So he just started reading all the titles and went through the years. And he talked about how if you're reading comics and then watching Superman, the closest that we ever really had was George. It matched up the best. And I was like, yeah, you're right. That at the time you could read a Superman comic, then look at the show. And that was probably the closest, gap we've had for the longest time. Because I always think George's Golden Age Superman. It was right there kind of starting to go to the Silver Age, depending on where you pinpoint the silver, But I always think, because I always feel like the shows are a little bit behind where the comics are. So, but what's your favorite portrayal of Clark?
All right, that's tough. I will, and bear with me, but I'm going to eliminate the Christopher Reeve because I've never loved, as much as it's a beautiful performance, the way he's able to differentiate the character. It's magnificent, but I've never liked that overly bumbling Clark, where it's really just facade. Superman is who he is. Clark is merely. I've never really liked it, so I wouldn't go there. The George one is high up on my list, but as you know from listening to my show, I am a big defender, Zack Snyder take on the character, and that's actually I'm going to go with Henry Cavill's Clark because I look at those movies. I always think of him as Clark. He's Clark throughout those films, whether he has the glasses on or the flannel or the costume. And so that's what I'm going to go with.
See, I always look at like, he's one person, but then it's kind of like how your mom, like grandma's coming over, you put on your best behavior. That's your Superman, like a little bit more polite, a little bit more of like a certain way, like if you're a professional, even though, you might be a real laid back kind of goofy person, but you don't walk into a professional setting cracking jokes all the time. And that's kind of where I look at like, his Clark Superman is kind of like this, like when he's Superman, he's a little bit more professional, and then maybe when he's Clark at work, he's a little bit more on. He leans into like his goofier side a little bit to give a little bit of a different. But he's never a different person. He's never being a completely different person. And that's just how I kind of gauge the whole Clark. He's not Batman. Batman he's Batman 24/7, and Bruce is this fake persona he creates really to just so people don't realize he's Batman. That's not Clark. That's not the Clark Superman identity.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I know I mentioned Lois and Clark. My wife and I are gearing up for a podcast rewatch of that. I'm looking forward to going back to that show. I haven't looked at that in, I don't know. I mean, it's been a really, really long. So this might change after I but the Clark Kent that we got in that show, he was really playing him like a regular guy, and I do think that there was a lot of value in that, especially in paving the way for depiction. I think it really gave, and of course the way written well, but I really feel like that show gave an integrity to Clark that definitely flowed from what was going on in the comics. There was definitely that whole turnover going on, and like you said, the way it tracks the comic, but especially as far as live action fiction, I felt like that gave some integrity to Clark, to Clark specific, that he hadn't had a while. Mm-hmm. So I do appreciate that take.
It's always interesting to put, when you put things a little bit more in that perspective, is that Lois and Clark was the first post-crisis version of the character. So it's our first live-action post-crisis Lex, and I think John Shea did a great job and often gets overlooked and gets kind of mixed. It's just like, I like Gene Hackman. I think he's great, but I don't see him as Lex because that's not the Lex that I knew and really kind of grew up with. So it's hard to kind of to see him as Lex. And then I was blown away by, even if no one watches the show, if you're a Superman fan, you're like, I'm not watching Supergirl, go watch the John Cryer Lex Luthor episodes, because his portrayal it blew me away. Like, I really, really like it. And I was surprised at how much I enjoyed his Lex Luthor.
Yeah. Rosenbaum for me is number one, but this was another example with Cryer where I was
LaCroix.
very nice.
I'm like, I'm not cracking a cold one. No, it's my LaCroix.
Hey, listen, even if I drink bourbon when I'm doing my show, so it's all right. I only have water tonight, but Cryer was another example where I was very, very skeptical. I watched 2.5 Men for 12 years. I watched the entire show. And so I had that certain image of him brained in my head. And, when they announced him, and even when they released that first bearded photo of him in prison, I don't think this is going to work. Then I watched that first full episode, and I was like, oh, okay. And I was, again, happy to be proven wrong, especially when I'm always happy to go from, I don't really like something, to, hey, this is great. I love going in that direction. That's beautiful. That's, at the end of the day, I think we all want to, or should want to enjoy this stuff.
Yes. I look at, like, you could almost do, like, Rosenbaum's Lex is the origin, and then Cryer's is, like, down the line. If you're looking at a timeline, Rosenbaum gave us the early years, and then, you have, like, the John Shea or the Kevin Spacey. It's kind of like, or the comics, and then the Cryer's Lex is finally seeing knowing that there's this history between him and Superman all these years. We're farther in their relationship. So it's a new take on Lex, being further down the line of his times table than we've had before, which, much like Tyler Hoechlin's Superman, is like, how do you do a new Superman show? Well, you make him already married with kids, and that's your new spin. So Lex has kind of it's that new spin. Next question. What's funny is so many of these we just answered in regular conversation. And I just want you to say this on air, but because I know your answer. But the Kents, live or dead?
Live, 100%.
I just wanted you to say it on my show because I already knew what you were going to say. But no, like, that was one of those things that I don't feel that Pa has to be dead. I don't think that Ma needs to be dead. The old, especially the times where, in the old George show and the Kirk Allen serials and stuff, the kids were like grandparents when they found Clark. And slowly we've de-aged them to be, I always picture them kind of like in their late 30s, maybe early 40s when they get Clark. So they're a little bit older than what their childbearing years would have been, But even in today's society, that's not old. Like, I don't want to say it's old, but, you look in the past, like you should have already had your kids by now. But I like the idea, like one of my favorite stories with them and was in Grant Morrison's action run in the New 52. It was like a backup where you see that Martha can't get pregnant and they go to like the fertility clinics and they're doing everything. They're like spending all their money. And it's like the last time they're driving home and, Martha's heartbroken. Like Jonathan's trying to keep her spirits up that he doesn't want to give up, but she's trying to say she's ready. And then you just see that ship crash and you're like, yes, it's like, it makes that much stronger for their story. And that was one that was, close to me when my wife and I were going through stuff.
I totally understand. Again, I'll leave, but I'll just say that I think, I think the question always is like, well, if one or both of them dies, what function does it serve? Valuable function. I think, in the premiere of Superman and Lois, Martha's passing that precipitates their move back to Smallville. We're now in a different phase of his life, and
right.
Sadly, losing a parent, especially as you get older, is something that people go through. So I felt like that was fitting. Going back to the idea of Jonathan's passing, imparting to Clark this valuable lesson, can't save everyone, and also sort of marking the end of his time in Smallville. I do recognize that could be valuable function of Jonathan's death, but in the end, I know a lot of this is informed by the fact that I grew up reading comics. My parents were around. I watched Smallville for a good part of the show. They were both there, and they were young and they were vital. And I just think that's one of the things that separates Superman from other characters. Like, he has there, and they're astounded forward. And some of the stories that I read from my recent event, there are a few instances where Jonathan and Martha are active.
Yes.
Like, there's a story where the Eradicator corrupts Superman's mind, and like Jonathan and Martha ultimately end up in the fortress and try to snap out of it. And I love stuff like that. So I'm all for them.
I always throw back to one thing is like every year my kids and I watch the Comfort and Joy episode of Justice League Unlimited. And it's the Christmas where Clark goes home and he takes Martian Manhunter with him. And Martha's like, we got the spare bedroom made up. You can stay in Kara's room. And, he's like, I don't have a present. And Martha's like, here you go. We always make extra. And he puts on the sweater. And I'm like, I just feel like, and then there was that meme that somebody did independently. Where it was a Mother's Day meme. And it's Clark hugging his mom. And Martha looks at Bruce and runs over and hugs Bruce. And I always look at Mom and Pop like the parents to everybody. Like, come on in. You're welcome. You're family, And I think it helps his character. And who was it? Said something about like one of the problems with Jeff Johns was when he came in, he wanted to give everyone like no parents. So like he did the story where Barry's mom's dead, he changed that. He's like, he wanted to kill off everybody's parents. And I think for some characters it works. Like, you can't have Batman without his parents, but you can have Superman without his parents. Like, he doesn't have to be birthed out of tragedy. Like, even the tragedy of his planet destroying, he has no connection to it. He doesn't learn that till later in his life. And like in The Death, I like the role that they play with Lois, both in the animated film that I really love, that you'll be reviewing soon, that I do want to hear. I got to sign up for that Patreon to check that out.
Out of professional courtesy, I'll send that to you.
Oh, hey, because what's funny is I rant and rave about how I get mad that I feel like so many times people think, the only story of Superman that matters is his death. Like, we're just going to kill him, and I rant and rave about that. But yet my favorite is I love that Death of Superman animated film. Like, I think I pick it as my favorite Superman film because I feel like it's a safe out. So you don't have to get in fights with people. I'm just like, I choose this one. I'm going to go over here now. So my next question is that question that divides all Superman fans. It's the one that will either, you're in or you're out. But trunks or no trunks?
It's so funny. I just recorded an episode with comic book artist V. Ken Mary, and we mostly focused on the 1997 Steel movie. Which, let me tell you, man, did we have fun with that. It was, and you might be surprised, we really mounted, I think, a pretty strong defense for that movie. But in any event, we did talk a little bit about the visual evolution style of. I asked him about the. He and I were kind of on the same page, and I really hate to sit on the fence on this. I don't feel that strong. I don't mind them. I'm not like, oh, they look stupid, they need to go. If they're there, great, but I don't feel like the costume is complete. They're missing as long as there's something to break up the. So the red belt, I'm fine. So, and again, I don't say that to sit on the fence, but I genuinely don't care that much.
Yeah, I'm there with you. My kind of breaking in piece is like, in comics is fine, because they're comics. Live action, I don't prefer them because I feel like you have to have the right suit and the right actor. Because I feel like Brandon Routh pulls it off. The way they designed his trunks in both, even in Superman Returns, but I think that they designed him really well in his Kingdom Come suit. And then Tyler, when he did his Fleischer suit, I think he pulled off. But I just don't think for a modern audience, you could keep those and really make it without being, because it feels like it's just an open joke to poke fun at him, because most people don't understand the history or the reference or what they were there for. And yeah, I think there are people who that's the sword they'll die on with Superman. No trunks, not my Superman, I'm just like, really? Like, okay. It's crazy that's the kill all. Now, here's one that I ask that a lot of times people will answer, but then they'll think about it. If you could have one Kryptonian power, what would it be?
I know flight is the one that most immediately grab, and there is tremendous appeal. I don't know. I would kind of say the strength. I think that's all where if I really, really had to pick this for an actual choice, that's what I would.
You know what's funny is that's where everybody starts. Like, flight's the obvious one, and then they talk it through, and I'm like, well, if I didn't have the invulnerability, how would flight work? It's like, if I didn't have the invulnerability, how would super speed work? Because like the Flash has the Speed Force to protect him and all that, but could you just imagine your skin like? So the invulnerability, because then I feel like how much better that helps me in everyday life.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, I feel like the flying, there would be that initial thrill, and you'd probably fly a lot initially. But then after a while, I feel like it could get a little old. Yeah, no, I go with the strength. Flash.
Yeah, I feel like that would just come in handy with everything. Like, oh, let me carry all these 5 gallons of buckets of paint to you. Yeah, look at this. Oh, you need your car moved? Oh, here you go. Oh, you want me to move your house? Got it. So the other thing that we are here to talk about, and this is one of those things that I am forcing myself to cut short because we could go on forever. And he has a family. I have a family. My wife understands, though. Let's just say when I first got on and I did the Always Hold On to Smallville, 3 hours later, we're still going. And my wife's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, Superman.
Listen, you and I we found a lot of common ground tonight. And that's another instance where my wife gets this. And, I schedule all of my recordings after our son goes to bed. And I come down here. And it's funny, though, because whenever I do, normally like we're doing this on a Sunday night. Normally I do mine on a Friday night. A lot of times before I go down here, I usually start around 8. I'll usually say like, hey, if I stay up, like I'll probably be done on 10 and watch something. And she's always like, yeah, sure. And sure enough, again, 2 to 3 hours later, where I finally resurfaced. So, no, I get it.
You're like, hey, and yeah, that just doesn't. But you and I also talk so much already, like, kind of knowledge. That's why I was like, some of these questions I was going to ask to get on air, but I know where he's going to go with it. But one thing, okay, so what we brought up for my conversation, I was like, one thing I've always thought about and I wanted to find someone to discuss about was what I call, excuse me, Faora versus Ursa. Because they're two different characters that seems like has been just used interchangeably, you know, through film, through comics. And I was like, what's the kind of the history? And like we'll do a discussion. We don't have to do a deep dive, but I was like, okay, let's chat about these characters, because I found it funny. And what I found most humorous, and we said this off mic, was recently Anthony did a review of the 1980s Ruby Spears Superman series that a lot of people forget existed. And when I saw that, I got excited because I had bought them on iTunes like real cheap years ago. And I watched them real quick, and then that was it. I had to fill in that knowledge. And one episode of that show has a very weird General Zod. A very weird General Zod. And it has 3 Kryptonian villains, but it's Zod, Faora, and Ursa. And it's the only time I found where Ursa and Faora are together. And I'm like, and it's this show. And it's not like they don't really do much or anything. Like, it's a episode to me, as I was watching, like, I could almost see some pre-Doomsday in there. Kind of like, it's also like side story about if you go back and watch John Wesley Shipp's The Flash, and you watched when Mark Hamill gets his sidekick, was it Prank? What they called her, I think. You definitely see that proto Harley Quinn. And I'm like, and I thought to myself, was Paul Dini sitting at home like, this is good. I like this. But I just thought, it'd be interesting. Like, is one character better than the other? Could you really carve out and have two really great distinctive versions, of these female characters? And so we're just going to kind of talk about them. Anthony's main assignment was Ursa, because coming off, discussing all the Reeve films, because that's really where she gets her start. And I was digging into Faora here, and I found it very interesting, just kind of digging through their history. And one thing that I found in a series that I never read, that I think I'm going to, because I found it very intrigued what they did with Faora, was the Bombshell series. Do you remember that run?
Yeah. I did not read it, but I am familiar.
I didn't either. I bought my wife the Wonder Woman cover issue. It was just because the artwork was cool, and she had like the shirt. And so I was doing some research, and Faora is like the main villain, and to the point where I'm trying to remember everything now, but like she gets a hold of like Raven's blood and power and mixes it, and Faora actually turns herself into that line's version of a Doomsday. And I mean, I was like, okay, like her biggest impact on comics is this side story over here. So I'm actually going to I think I'm going to read through it, just because I'm now more intrigued, and I didn't get a chance to read it. But
yeah, I appreciated you inviting me on the show generally, but this was an interesting assignment. And it's one of those things that I was especially happy to do, because I would never have done this on my show, but not because I don't think it's a good idea. It's because I wouldn't have thought about this. And I had never thought. And when you were like, we have these two female Kryptonians, and how, if at all, can we distinguish them? How have they think ways? And again, until you had brought that up, in all honesty, had never really pondered in any significant way. And so I did the homework that you asked me to for Ursa, but I also did most of the Faora research as well, because I wanted to be able to get as much of the full picture as possible. Honestly, I mean, I would love to know if you came up with anything different, but for the life of me, I mean, I really could not distinguish characters. My take is that they've been used interchangeably, and I do think that's at the detriment of both of them.
Yes, the only main difference that I've been able to find is one where it gets more confusing. You can see this is when Faora first appears, she's more of a brunette, Kryptonian villainess, and then Ursa, of course, was on Superman the movie, and she had black hair. But then when Faora reappears later, we start seeing like different changes. But then when Faora was in, where is it on my notes here? Oh, and there it is.
Superman, Wonder Woman?
It was in Justice League Action. She's back to being a brunette. And then when she appeared in the Superman Wonder Woman New 52 comic, she just straight up was Zack Snyder's Faora. But they used the dark hair, even in that film, like Ursa. And to the average comic book, like just film watcher, you would never know. But the only difference that I have discerned is that Faora often is lined up as a lover, partner, wife to Zod. Ursa is never aligned as Zod's lover. That is the main difference that I've discovered.
So I guess one potential exception, that last Sun arc of Action Comics that Jeff Johns, Richard Donner co-wrote. Now, I only read the part that you had specifically assigned. I mean, I have read the whole thing years. But in that, they show up as the parent of young boy Lois and Clark take in. Mm-hmm. But do we find out later that it wasn't a product of love, that it was just strategic union? Is that the case?
Yeah, I'm like 90% sure. Because I actually read it and I was going to pull it back out because I just rebought it because I had it digitally. But then when Donner passed, I decided like, all right, I'm going to pull the and buy it. But what's interesting is I actually just found for $5 that Zod figure at the con yesterday. And what's interesting, and we'll kind of bring Zod into this for a quick second, is these Kryptonian villainesses, they've never had a definitive look. We always have the House of El glyph. And then they wanted to give every family. Zod's never had a glyph that you could look at and say, that's Zod. So the comics has always kind of been something different. They didn't do anything in the Donner films. Michael Shannon's glyph is different than Callum Blue's glyph. And even the glyph for the House of Zod they used on Krypton, the series. There's never been a consistent look even for Zod. The actor that played Zod for like the 2 seconds in Superman and Lois was blonde, and then we got a whole new reinterpretation of Zod on Krypton, which Colin Salmon is my favorite Zod. Just throwing that out there because I feel like he embodied what I loved about Terrence Stamp, but then he was able to embody what I loved about Michael Shannon, and he just found a nice way of pulling it around and putting his own spin on it. So that's one of the highest points of the Krypton series was his portrayal of Zod. And if anyone disagrees with me, that's fine. It's all subjective. So with that logic, is even the main antagonist to the House of El, there's not consistency. So then when we get to Faora and Ursa, it's just like, female, evil. Throw her in there.
And that's basically it. I mean, I think in most of these incarnations, whether it's Faora or Ursa, they are cold and calculating, usually 8 men, and are aligned with Zod, at least ideologically, or in the case of Faora, I mean, that's kind of it. And even when we get down to the look, we have, especially again in these recent, I mean, again, if you look at, like you're saying, the Faora of the Superman and Wonder Woman run, I mean, again, it's that short black hair. You could easily mistake her for Ursa. So, and your point about Zod is well taken. I mean, obviously, Zod is a character who does stand on his own, but to your point, I mean, yeah, there are still aspects of the character that, aren't so clearly defined the way other characters have been. I think with Zod, it's further complicated by the post-crisis comics, which now, again, I've spent a lot of time
That's
on.
Why you're here. That's why you're here.
But and it's one of those where post-Crisis, DC, of course, scaled back all of these other Kryptonian characters, made it that Clark truly was the last on Krypton. But, Zod was a valuable villain, so over that period between, Crisis on Infinite Earth and the Richard Donner, Jeff Johns Last on arc, where they finally reintroduced actual Zod for Krypton, we had all other versions. We had the Lock Universe Zod. We had the Russian metahuman Zod Joe Kelly was playing around with. We had the For Tomorrow Zod that Brian Azzarello played around with. So there were all of other Zods before we finally got the one true. I don't think that helped. And that's one of the aspects, much as, my heart with post-Crisis Superman. Up with so many runs there. Big fan of. I started my podcast with the Loeb Kelly at spot. But that being said, don't quasi versions of certain characters like Supergirl, like God. These attempts to have the character without running afoul of the only one Kryptonian rule. I don't think that did those characters any favor. So yeah, I think that further muddies the waters.
Oh, I agree. I'm a fan of Superman as the last Kryptonian, but for story purposes, I like that you had Zod, a female. I'll say that for as we have this conversation, and then the three Kryptonian villains, because I think it puts a different aspect on the Kryptonian culture. It also, for a story point, it gives Clark this sense of, I'm not alone. These could be people I connect with, but really they're not. So it's has even more dramatic point. Now, I also am a fan of having his cousin Supergirl because, and this is, I don't know if I should edit this out, but we'll see. This is a story that has not been told by DC that I want to tell. We have Zor-El and Jor-El, but they never do a story with them together. Who are these brothers? What is their story? And I have it. I'm just going to say this. Okay, I got it. I got it, bro. And the irony of why I say that is because my first name is Jonathan. Tyler's my middle name. That's what I go by. So, J. My younger brother, who is blonde-haired, his name is Zach. Z. His wife is blonde. My wife is also brunette like me. So we have this parallel of J and Z. And my brother, because of situations that my wife and I occurred, had his son was born before mine. So from that events in my life, I started getting the story of two brothers that have a massive fallout. And had maybe the brothers L worked together, they could have saved Krypton, but they were opposing each other. And in the end, in Tyler's story, because you have and I won't give too much away, but you have always Kara was sent, or Kara, well, that's a whole nother discussion, to look after baby Cal. The idea is, in the end, family was important and for our children to make up for our mistakes. And I feel like that's the story they've not told. And that's why I like the idea of having Supergirl. Now, I like the idea when Supergirl is there, she's with him, but then she goes off and finds her own destiny. The idea of Superman or Supergirl being with the Legion or being out in space works for me because I feel like she goes off to find her destiny. So I'm not a fan of Kandor is a kind of a iffy thing, I don't like the idea he can just go down into Kandor. I like when they had Brainiac has it, but they're all asleep, in a coma. I'm okay with that. Because from dramatic story point of view, it's that thread of there's my people. I have to save them. What can I do? But I can't figure it out. Compared to New Krypton or Argo City or, all this other where you're just that's just a lot, Yeah.
Well, first of all, the story you proposed, fast. That would be amazing to actually see come to life, comic book form otherwise. So kudos for that. I really think that's things that's so funny about a character who's been around for decades. Yet there are still that's uncharted territory, that can be mined. So I think that's an example where that rich story. So yeah, I think something that would be cool. And yeah, I think as far as the other Kryptonians, I think there's a fine line. I don't think it's all or nothing. I think there's a balance. Right. I think with Zod and Ursa or Faora and On, with the villains who are primarily in the Phantom Zone, I think that works fine, right? They're not ever present,
right?
Not ever present. So I think that's okay. And I agree with you with Kandor. He can kind of jump there whenever he wants. It definitely loses some impact. So handle the right way. Kandor's awesome. Too like Supergirl. And the thing the conclusion I've come to, having read the beginnings of Matrix Supergirl from the 90s, is that if that value weren't there, if there weren't need for a Supergirl, they wouldn't have bent over backwards to create this pocket universe protoplasm being that morphed into Supergirl.
Yeah, I mean, she serves a purpose, and the comics. Her history in the comics is not great. We'll just say that. It's a very weird, unbalanced history. Much like, with Faora and Ursa, because if my writing assignment was use them both, I think where I would lean is, I'd put them like in a military academy together, but you would have this where Faora and Ursa really get along, but Ursa goes darker. And Faora has this here because, for example, we'll jump here, but my brain's all over the place. Ursa, okay, we'll start with her. She appears in Superman the movie and Superman 2. Mentioned before the Ruby Spears episode, The Hunter. She appears in the 2019 animated series DC Superhero Girls, which is it's a fun show. I watch it with my daughter.
Very fun. I had never watched it before, and then I watched that one, and it was a lot of fun. And when my son gets a little older, I would definitely put that on. I was pleasantly surprised by it.
My watched the premiere of that series with my daughter, and then my son watches it. He's cool because him and his sister are sweet because he'll watch shows with her, and she'll watch shows with him. So she'll I want to watch My Little Pony. He'll sit down and watch it with her, and then he'll be like, let's watch this, and she'll watch it. So they really get along great together about that. And so she appears there. And then the comic we talked about was in the Action Comics 845, which is the second part of The Last Son by Jeff Johns and Richard Donner. Ursa is introduced into the Superman comic canon, which is very interesting because that's her one, and she's very Sarah Douglas looking in the face and the hair. And that's the one definitive Ursa in the comics. And and then with Faora, she first appears in Action Comics 471 and then 472. And then really no notable until we were talking about the New 52 Superman Wonder Woman issues 5 and 6, which are great. But like I said, it feels very Man of Steel because I feel like with some of these side characters, whatever the contemporary television or film version is, they'll kind of twist them into that. But then the other Faora that we got her, of course, in the film Man of Steel. But she was also in season 9 of Smallville. She's actually a character. It's a younger Faora. And that was not to dive into all Smallville, but in the lore of that season was the Kandorians were actually clones that were, when their blood was taken, they were younger than when they actually ended their life. So when these clones were birthed on Earth, they were younger. So he wasn't General Zod. And Faora is much younger. She's actually has more of an ethnicity to her than just a white person. And she has a sister, which had never been introduced before, named Fala. And I thought that was cool. And then, of course, Faora gets pregnant with her and Zod's child, and then Zod kills her because he was a weirdo. And that Zod. And then in Superman, in Smallville season 8, like you were talking about earlier, the Phantom version possesses Lois, and we find out that Faora was married to Zod. They couldn't have children, which that is very And that's actually in my story. This advanced Kryptonian technology, but whatever. So they create a being, which in this is they created Doomsday as like their child. And I actually really liked the whole Davis Bloom thing. Just side note, in the Doomsday, the way they did on Smallville, because I love Sam Witwer as an actor, and I think he pulled it off amazingly of that character. So it worked for me, even though I think the ending sucked. But the whole how they kind of like got rid of Doomsday in that sucked, but whatever. And then Faora appears in the Looney Tunes show Super Rabbit, which I watched a clip on YouTube because I couldn't find the actual episode, and Justice League Action episode Field Trip. Justice League Action, we're big fans on the show. We love Jason J. Lewis and his Superman voice, one of our favorites here on the show. So, yeah, like, it's amazing to me how they always try to pin Zod with a female, but we have these two where they're like really almost cut and paste of each other. And it's sad to me that with all the creativeness, and the other thing is, with comics, I'm really big on hair color. Okay? Like, I know some people are like, oh, that's why I really have an issue. But, you know, you can kind of let it slide. But Amy Adams as Lois Lane being redheaded really bothers me. Because when I think redhead, it's Lana. You know, even though, like, they've changed Lana's look, but, like, in the comics, she was always the redheaded girl. And when you're looking at comics art, certain things need to be met to really help you know that's the character, because this person draws it different than this person, you know? So having these, looking like the different animation version of Faora, or where they make Faora look like Ursa, but they call her Faora, it makes it more complicated of who's who, because they're just interchanging things. That's my quick rant. Your turn.
Oh, I mean, I'm with you. I like I said, I really think this does disservice. I think that's why, I mean, at least from my perspective, I don't think either one has ever cemented, you know, the way Zod had. I think that could have been achieved if you had picked one, you know, and portrayed her consistently, or if you are going to utilize both, do so in a way where they each have their own function to serve. And I'm with you, that Ruby Spears episode, that's my favorite episode from the series. They only did 13, but Hunter is my favorite. I did an article for 13th Dimension. I counted that. That was my number one. And to your point, so in the premise of that, right, is that the three of them are in the Phantom Zone and they conjure this Hunter that is very similar. I mean, I really think you can look at that as a forerunner to Doomsday, very sync-minded, adapt, and, you know, they're able to send the Hunter to Earth to fight. Like, yeah, the three of them are there. And I just took another look at that before we sat to do this. And Faora doesn't speak. Ursa does all the talking. So this one moment where it's like, okay, how would they interact with each other? Anything. And look, I mean, you know, that cartoon has its charm, but I don't know how much nuance I would expect from that anyway. Doesn't it?
Yeah.
So it's really disappointing. And, you know, it's because I know, obviously, I covered Supergirl. Would have been interesting. Oh, of course, first season of Super headed her. But it would have been interesting if they took Ursa or Faora, really reimagined her as Supergirl's version of Zod. Something like that. Really, you know, I could have done without Rain, and I think that would have been a perfect season to shine a spotlight and actually do something for Ursa or both. I really think it was a top.
I agree with you, because, you know, when Supergirl first was pitched, one of the early episodes of the podcast was, well, do you do the show as if she's the Superman of the show? Like, there is no Superman, there's just Supergirl. Or, you know, how they went and did it. But then you know, she was against her Aunt Astrid, and then their Non shows up. But this is like Non before, like, a lot of people don't know, like, in Non's history, he was very intelligent, but then, depending on the writer, when they were on Krypton, he had a brain injury or damage or whatever, and that's what made him more into just the brute muscle, you know, simple-minded beast. And this, of course, was a Non that was smart, but didn't really feel like Non. It was just Non by name alone. And you're just kind of like, what? But I mean, and with the Rain thing, it was like she was Rain, but nothing like the Rain that was in the comics. And looking at her suit and everything, it would have been much better to just make her, even if they had went where it was Faora, like the Phantom Faora, or Ursa that had possessed it. What was her name? I can't remember the character's name. Sam. Yeah, I was like, it's on the tip of my tongue. Sam, and did that and made her, like you said, more of her Zod, because a lot of the things in Supergirl was who are the female villains. We'll just give them the female version, the female villain. And I just think that, on Superman and Lois, spoiler, we got a character who kind of filled that role. It's like they didn't want to do Zod, so they found another way of doing the character. And they didn't exactly want to do Faora or Ursa, so they found a way who was actually a Supergirl villain. But I feel like they've done these two characters a disservice, and I feel like there is a way to give them distinctive features, styles, and really write a story with. We can have more than one evil Kryptonian villain, female, and I think we should. I mean,
yeah. I mean, that's it's funny. I know this wasn't part of our homework, but I was also thinking about the way Superman the animated series handled these characters. Didn't get those versions. Mala,
yeah,
Jack, right?
Yeah,
and so there's yet another version of a Kryptonian female. I just feel like, again, it continues sort of like, but with the same characteristics. That's the problem.
Yep.
When you have now with her, and piling on here, that John Byrne post-crisis story, Supergirl saga, his swan song book, when Superman executes the 3 Kryptonian criminals to annihilate all of billions on the world. It's Zod. I actually forget who the third name, but the woman is Zayor. So Faora with the Z. Oh. And I had to double check that. And I read it fairly recently, but it's one of those, like, it didn't make much of an impression. And when I double checked, it was like, yeah, this was Zayor. So like yet another version of a female character, a female Kryptonian villain with, again, the same set character. So yeah, again, it's just they haven't done either one any favor. I think that's prevented either or both from occupying the same prominence that Zod does. And I think I love Zod is one of my favorite Superman, but it would be nice to have a deeper bend. It doesn't always have to be Zod. And especially like we've been saying, we're talking about Supergirl or someone else. It would be nice to have someone else you can kind of pull in to hit her up.
I mean, with the Zayor thing, it makes me think back to earlier comics. What do you call it? When they first did Luthor, there was Luthor, O-R, and there was Luthor, E-R, and they kind of were using it interchangeably, and it was eventually they were like, we have to pin this down and make a correct, name. And it makes you wonder, like, was it a typo, or was it, because it's a pocket dimension, it can be a little different. But yeah, I mean, with all the content we're getting now in live action and, reboots and anime, like, you would think someone could sit down and be like, look, we really need to make something distinguishable with these two characters and utilize them.
Or alternative suggestion. You go the opposite direction. Or you come up with some version where her full name is like Faora Ursa. It's like, you know what I mean? Because other than Ruby Spears, that lost Ruby Spears, where they're both there together. Actually, you know what? Now that I'm saying it, that might be the way to go, because at Ruby Spears' side, they're never together.
Yeah,
all these other versions.
Well,
so maybe they're one character.
It could be. I mean, because with that thinking, we did a whole conversation piece on how Kryptonians name their children, their daughters, why Kara is Kara Zor-El, so that she inherits her father's name. You know, and it was Laura Lorvon, so she inherits her father's name. You know, that's why it's just Jor-El, Kal-El. So could Faora be like, her name is Faora Ul, U-L, so it could be like Faora Ursa Ul, you know what I'm saying? Her dad was, you know what I'm saying? Like something like that, because, you know, in a lot of ways that could be the best way to go, just because, like I said, the only difference that we've been able to really find is Faora has the romantic relationship with Zod, and Ursa hasn't. Unless you made them sisters, like twin sisters. I mean, that'd be the other way to go, where one's a little bit darker and one, you know what I'm saying? Because then you can just feel, I think an interesting story with them that I'm coming up with right now would be interesting if you got Granny Goodness involved and she took one of them and made them into one of her Furies, much like how she tried to pull Supergirl into the Furies. But like I said, it's not a conversation we can really dive deep in because there's not a lot, but it's like a think piece of just like, hey, there's these two characters that are, I mean, you know, in the comics now, we now have because of the New 52 and Rebirth, we have a Wally West, but then we have a Wallace West, you know? So they're not opposed to having almost these kind of double characters in the stories, that something could be done about this. So,
yeah, no, like I said at the top, I had not really given this much thought and brought it up. But imagine among your listeners, sure there are others who fall in the category who maybe had never really thought about how you treat the character separately, because they have been used for change. So I think to be able to shine a light on this issue is worthwhile. So again, I appreciate you having fun. Yeah, I hope, you know, whatever the case, sisters or merge them into one character, whatever. There is potential there. Would both at Eli.
We can. I mean, make them cousins. And I say that just because it's that 1 degree off, and it kind of huckles back to maybe Ursa is Zod's, because I'm writing it right here in my head. So anyways, that's how I would do it. Ursa is Zod's cousin, and Faora is his woman, his wife, his companion, or depending on which Kryptonian history. Yeah, I got it. I'll go down that rabbit hole later. But yeah, it was a nice conversation to kind of bring up, and we could keep going, but you know, I'll try to keep it to about an hour and a half here for you. Because I feel like if we could keep going, and then it'd be like, oh, put on another pot. Like the funny part is I have right here to my left is my Superman coffee pot maker. Just flip that on, let it brew, and just be like,
Well, no, you and I will be talking again because we have an episode coming up. We're going to record my show for Big Krypton. So we'll be doing this again. We'll see how long we go at report. But I'm looking forward.
Yes, it should. So as we wrap up here, any other plugs for any of the other shows, different podcasts? Where can people find you online? Like what's your preferred? Like I know, like I'm on a different social media, but there's certain ones I never check my Instagram. I never get on Instagram, but you can always get a hold of us on Facebook and Twitter. The easiest. What's the best for you?
So I mean, the podcast is Digging for Kryptonite, Superman. That's on all major podcast platforms. So I encourage people to check it out and subscribe, like it. And as far as social media, there's the Digging for Kryptonite Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter. I do check all of them. It's funny. I've heard Twitter, but I found doing this podcast, that's where I tend to get most traction, hear from people, connect. So that's, well, it's happened on all of that. But Twitter, I've actually found to be the most beneficial with respect to this podcast, more so than anything I've done before. So on Twitter in particular, it's at Digging for KR Pod. The show, that was hard to get that handle down. But so that's Digging for KR. That's on. But wherever anyone would want to reach out, I'm happy to connect. And if you want just the sort of the master hub, it's flatsquirrelproductions.com. All my stuff.
All right. Well, thank you, Anthony, for being here and being part of everything with us today. Check out his podcast. I'm telling you, it's a great listen. It's I'm always, every time the new episode drops and I listen, I'll listen. I'll be sending him little messages because it's that kind of conversation where you feel like you wish you were there, sitting there as part of the conversation, because it just sounds like two friends talking, and you're one of them that just happens to be like out of earshot. Like you're the guy in there making. Then you're like, yeah, guys, I'm with you. While they're in the living room talking. So
I appreciate that very much. Thank you. I love what you, your other hosts have done. Your show. Again, like I said, I've been so happy to connect with you. I love getting those messages. That's really, as you know, you put stuff out. You never know how it's going to be received, and hopefully it's something that you enjoy doing in and of itself. So even if you don't hear anything, you're still happy that you did it. But when you do get some feedback, it's always lovely. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Look up in the sky.
The Krypton Report is a Tears production. We thank you for listening and enjoying, and please support us on our Patreon account, our TeePublic store, and check out our social media. Always remember to look up in the sky. Hey, can I get $1? Sure. That's what friends say, right? And we all know that we all have $1. We spend $1 on crazy stuff. We have a loose change around the house probably for $1. So why not help a friend out? The Krypton Report, of course, has a Patreon, like every podcast does. But unlike other podcasts where we're asking for a lot of money, we're just saying, hey, shoot us $1. $1 a month, help us keep the podcast going, and help us to bring entertainment to you. And you can hear the fun voices of me and James. So go to patreon.com/Krypton Report and give it a shot. Thanks. If you enjoy Superman podcasting, here's some others to check out. Digging for Kryptonite, The Last Sons of Krypton, The Aspiring Kryptonian. That all comes back to Superman. Superman Forever. All-Star Superman Podcast. Superman, the Animated Podcast. Always Hold On to Smallville. And Superboy Legacy Podcast. Check them out. Always a good time. Always something new. Enjoy.